Tux, do you want to come down? Come sit in my lap? Yeah, you want to? No, you don't want to? What are you doing? You're crazy. Hi. So, I just need to talk about this book. This video is about Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. To give a little background about why I read this book, I got recommended a video on YouTube about Flowers in the Attic and the Flowers in the Attic series. And I put that book in my watch later because I was like, I want to read the book before I actually watch this video. And then about a month or so later, I was like, I'm probably never going to read Flowers in the Attic. So I clicked on it. And then there was like a 5-minute spoiler warning disclaimer at the beginning of that video. And it intrigued me so much that I moved this book up to the top of my TBR. And I read it. And I wasn't totally sure if I wanted to do a video. Like, I had a lot of thoughts at the time, and I wrote a lot of notes while I was reading it. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a video on the book. But after watching the video, I disagreed with the creator so much that I decided that, yeah, I definitely need to make a video. No hate to that original creator. I understand why she feels the way she does because, you know, she explained herself in the video. But I think that she gave Andrews too much grace. So that's why I'm making this video. It's because I don't want to give V.C. Andrews any grace. Let's begin. Flowers in the Attic was written in 1979. And it's written by the aforementioned V.C. Andrews, Virginia something Andrews. If you have heard anything about this book, you know that in no small part it contains incest. I'm going to be doing this review in a similar way to the other incest book that I reviewed, The Tearsmith. I will be giving a summary of the plot, interspersed with my commentary. So heavy spoiler warning for this terrible book if you have never read it before and you are interested in reading it. Don't watch this video first. Also, a trigger warning for incest, for rape, child abuse, and death of a child. I'm going to be discussing the sexual assault in this book for quite a bit at the end. I will give another warning before then, but if that's a trigger for you, you might want to skip that part of the video or just sit this one out entirely. This book begins with Kathy Dollanganger describing her perfect family that really loves love. She makes a point that love is really important in their family, unlike other families. At the moment, there is Christopher, the father, so he's Christopher Sr. There's Corinne, the mother, Christopher Jr., he goes by Christopher, and the father goes by Chris, and Kathy, the daughter. So the first chapter starts with Corinne announcing that she's having twins, a boy and a girl. Kathy throws a fit because she is worried that her dad isn't going to love her as much now that there are more kids coming, specifically another girl coming. But Chris, Sr., assures her that, of course, he's going to love her forever. Then, on his birthday, not the sequential birthday, but 5 years in the future, Chris dies in a car accident. So because this is 5 years in the future, the twins, Carrie and Corey, those are their twins. They're 5 years old. Kathy is 12, and Christopher, who from this point on goes by Chris, and I will be referring to him as Chris only, not Chris Jr., and Chris is 14. Their mother, Corinne, is losing it. She spends all her time writing letters and just patently not mothering. And then she grabs her kids at like, I don't know, like in the evening, she's like, we are leaving here now. They're repossessing the house and all of our possessions. We have no money and we're going to be living with my uber super disgustingly rich parents. The only problem is my dad disowned me for a mysterious reason that I can't tell you about. I have to get into his good graces and his will before I can tell him about you. So yeah, you guys are going to have to hide in the attic until then. And then she ditches. She's like, bye. And so they're locked in this room in their grandmother's house or their grandparents' house by their very tall, very strict grandmother who their grandmother, Olivia, hates them. For a reason that they don't understand, she keeps calling them devil's spawn and devil's issues. And also in the room that she locked the kids in. She hung up really like grotesque pictures depicting like sinners being punished. She's very strict on the kids, specifically about not being immodest and lusty and things like that. The opposite gender is not even supposed to look at each other. And then Corinne explains why. So basically, okay, family tree time. Corinne is the daughter of Malcolm and Olivia, and they have always been super religious. Like, that's a huge thing about Malcolm and Olivia. They're very religious. And Corinne was Malcolm's favorite kid. And he was, like, obsessed with her. He didn't like anyone talking to her. He wanted her always in his sight. He was like, you're my favorite. Don't let anyone talk to you. Malcolm's half-brother's mother died. And so his half-brother comes to live with the Foxworths, who are Malcolm and Olivia and Corinne and her two brothers. And Malcolm's younger brother is much younger than he is. And he's Christopher Foxworth. So now Christopher is living at the Foxworth Manor. Christopher is 17 and Corinne is 14. And Corinne says it was love at first sight with her and her half-uncle. And they run off and get eloped. And then Malcolm is like, literally, what the fuck? You just married your uncle. You are out of the will. Now, in the present, come here. Do you want to come sit on my lap and be in a video? No, he does not want to be in a video at all, apparently. Now, in the present, Malcolm is dying. And Corinne is trying to get back into the will so that she can inherit the whole estate and her 4 kids can come out of hiding and live filthy rich with her. But unfortunately, things do not go as originally planned. The Dollenganger children stay locked up in the attic for 3.5 years. In that time, Corinne steadily becomes more and more distant from the kids, and Kathy and Chris take on a more parental role to the twins, Carrie and Corey. I want to interject right here and say that I think this book and the themes it explores could have been good if this book wasn't so damn pervy. We'll get into that more near the end. I also think that the focus of the traditional American nuclear family is what makes it so weird. You know how men have this one role. They're strong, smart, they're the provider. And then women have this other role. Beautiful, graceful, compassionate, emotional. And then lastly, children have another role. Innocent, playful, quote-unquote stupid, naive. And it doesn't matter that both Chris and Kathy are both still children and they're being emotionally, physically, mentally abused. And that's the reason that they have stepped into the de facto role of parents. They are men and women in this book as V.C. Andrews presents it. That's how they are seen. I'll touch on this again as we get further into the video. So just be a bit patient with me. The 2 older children are hitting puberty, which is already an extremely volatile time of a child's life. And then add on to the fact that they have absolutely no one telling them what is going on with their bodies, only what they can see in books and what they knew before going into the attic. Kathy is especially naive when it comes to her body. No one explained periods to her, and so her brother has to tell Corinne, hey, she's 13, she's gonna get her period soon, can you please explain that to her so she's not freaked out? And then she's left to deal with her body developing and changing in very extreme ways without having any other female figure in her life to help her through it. And then even Chris, who I hate and despise and who's awful, he's also having a time of it because he's also going through puberty. He's having wet dreams and his body is changing extremely. And it makes sense that these kids who have no one else to express these feelings towards would feel sexually frustrated at the very least. So I want to say that V.C. Andrews makes sense in the stories that she's writing, but the way that she told the story is very flawed. Again, I wouldn't dislike this book so much if it wasn't so pervy. At one point, Kathy is looking at her own naked body in the mirror, and Chris is watching her from the closet. It's weird, he's a perv, and I hate him. And then their grandmother, Olivia, comes in and sees the 2 of them admiring Kathy's body. And she's like, oh, you 2 are gonna have sex. She obviously doesn't say it like that. And Chris knows what she's talking about. She knows what she means when she says, like, oh, you're leading up to this next point. But Kathy is still so naive. Kathy is going through puberty in an attic. She hasn't had any form of sex ed except for when her neglectful mother came to talk to her about her period and also said that Chris's body was going through some changes. Kathy is naive when it comes to sex. She doesn't know about it. She doesn't know what it is beyond the fact that it sort of exists to her. Chris does know what it is, and while yes, he is also going through puberty alone in an attic with no one else to teach him these things, just knowing about the act of sex and what it entails gives him power over Kathy, which makes their situation unequal. One thing I saw both in the video that I watched prior to this and in lots and lots and lots of positive reviews on Goodreads, this book has a 3.85 star rating on Goodreads, which is very good. Anything over 3.5 is a good rating on Goodreads. So one thing that I saw a lot in lots of reviews is that this book is romantic. And, like, no, obviously it's not. So Corinne, who has become more distant towards her children, comes into the attic and tells the kids that she's gotten remarried. And Kathy, who hates her mother, asks, okay, did you tell him about the 4 kids that you have locked in an attic that you've had with your uncle husband? And Corinne is like, you ungrateful bitch, I have sacrificed so much for you by stowing you away in a room and not ever paying you any attention or love. How could you be so rude? So also around this time is the scene I mentioned before that happened with Kathy looking at herself in the mirror and then Chris peeping on her and Olivia walking in on it. And Olivia basically says, you're a sinner and you're too vain. You need to cut off all your hair. Like, it's making you more vain. And Chris is like, no, I'm not letting you cut off her hair. I would rather die. And Olivia's like, okay, so I'll just starve you until you cut off her hair. And then she pours tar onto Kathy's head, which isn't really relevant to what I'm talking about, but it is, like, fairly scarring. Another interjection. Andrews always makes a point of emphasizing that the Doppelgangers are blue-eyed and blonde and very fair-skinned. And despite all the complications that could have happened from having children with your half-uncle, none of these kids are disabled. They are all perfect and beautiful. And it's so much to the point that when someone has brown hair, they're kind of shown as devious because of it. I remarked several times in my notes that it was giving Nazi vibes, and I stand by that. I think that V.C. Andrews loved the Aryan race. So eventually, the Doppelgangers are fed again after like 2 weeks. So they have been severely malnourished before this point. In the picnic basket that their grandmother left for them, there are 4 powdered donuts. And the kids have never been allowed to eat sweets by their grandmother because sugar leads to cavities, and obviously they can't go to the dentist if they're locked in an attic. But every day after this, in their picnic basket, they get 4 powdered donuts. And this goes on for about 9 months. So for some time, since being practically abandoned by their mother, the 2 elder Doppelgangers have been saying, we need to get out of here, our mother is never going to set us free, and we need to get ourselves out. So they hatch a plan to steal enough money from Corinne and her husband Bart. $500 is their goal. They take an impression of Corinne's master key in a bar of soap, and then they whittle a key out of hard wood based off that impression so that they can get in and out of the room. And Chris starts stealing money from Corinne and Bart's room, but one day he's got food poisoning or something, and Kathy goes to get some money. Unbeknownst to her, however, her stepfather is in the room, asleep, and Kathy is overtaken. She's looking at his sleeping body and she kisses him. She says, just to know also what a kiss was like from a stranger who was no blood relation at all. And I was like, okay, Andrews, I will give you this. That's a pretty normal thing to think, all things considered, because at this point she had been sharing a few stray kisses with her creepy brother, and it would make sense that she would want to know what the lips of someone else felt like. Then, the next time that Chris goes out to steal from his mother, Corinne and Bart come back into the room while he's still in there, so he hides in a closet. And while he's in the closet, Corinne and Bart are arguing, and Bart drops the little factoid that he had a dream where a younger version of his wife gave him a kiss, and Chris is like, OMG, that little slut, because he knows that it's Kathy. So he confronts Kathy in the attic, and he says, you're mine, Kathy. Mine. You'll always be mine. No matter who comes into your future, you'll always belong to me. I'll make you mine tonight. Now. And then he rapes her. So to anyone thinking that this book is romantic, I want you to remember that Christopher rapes his sister, his supposed romantic interest. Now, V.C. Andrews goes to great lengths to victim shame Kathy, forcing Kathy in her inner monologue to say, yeah, I didn't want my brother to force himself on me, but I could have done something to stop it, and it's basically my fault for having a body that my brother might be attracted to and letting him look at it. And while Kathy expresses multiple times that she is not interested in anything happening with Chris ever again, saying in her monologue, nothing gross was ever going to happen between us again. Never, never again. Chris tells her, I'm never going to love anyone but you, Kathy. I know it. I've got that kind of feeling. Just us, always. Again, showing that one person here is the aggressor and the other one's the victim. Shortly after this, Corey, the boy twin, Corey falls violently ill. Kathy forces Olivia and Corinne to take him to a hospital, but it's too late and he dies. Corinne hastily has the body buried under an assumed name, pretending that nothing ever really happened. This is the inciting incident that forces the kids to leave the attic once and for all. Chris takes one last trip to steal from his mother. Here's what he learns on that trip. Number 1, Corinne and Bart are gone and they have taken all their jewelry and valuables with them except Corinne's original wedding/engagement band and a photo of the Dollanganger's father. Chris returns empty-handed except for these things. Number 2, Malcolm Foxworth, their grandfather, who the Dollangangers have been waiting 3.5 long years to die so that they can be let out of the attic, has been dead for 9 months. Number 3, Malcolm included a codicil in his will that states that if it's ever discovered that Corinne had children from her first marriage or she ever has children in her second marriage, everything that she inherited will be stripped from her. And number 4, the powdered donuts that they have been eating for the past 9 months are poisoned with arsenic. Their mother has been slowly poisoning them so that they pose no threat to her inheritance. They all flee into an early morning light and hop onto a train to Charlottesville and a bus to Sarasota. Finn. I think people who really like this book beyond the romance aspect of it like it because Andrews is basically saying that when you try to isolate something in order to kill it, you just provide a space for that thing to grow and develop. What I mean, Olivia was so disgusted by her daughter's incest and the products of that incest that she locked them away, forcing them into an incestuous relationship. By trying to kill the thing, she created it. And the people who like this book because of the romance, it makes sense to them that Kathy and Chris would fall in love. But here's the thing. Kathy and Chris aren't real. V.C. Andrews decided to write this story, and that's fine. I'm not trying to police what someone wants to write, or in this case, already has written, but it is fiction. And the way that Andrews handled this relationship was done poorly. Like, even if you want to ignore the glaringly obvious fact that Chris raped Kathy and the glaringly obvious fact that he is her brother, Kathy says that she doesn't want anything to happen between the two of them. And she doesn't frame it in the context of sin. She just says she doesn't want anything gross to happen between the two of them. It's also framed in the very sexist way that Andrews wrote the book, where Chris is masculine and he can't control his urges, and Kathy's just a dainty little woman. Mind you, she's 15 years old, and she needs to be more in control of her feminine wiles, otherwise she's accountable to her brother raping her. I wanted to compare O Caledonia by Elizabeth Barker, which I read for my last video, and I gave 5 stars to this book for a few reasons. Number 1, I read them in tandem, so it's a bit hard for me not to associate them in my mind. And number 2, because I think that these books have a lot in common, which only proves to point out the flaws in Flowers in the Attic. Both are Gothic novels written by female authors in the late 20th century. Both books are set around the same time period. Both books feature young girls going through puberty as their protagonists. Now, while these books have similar elements, their plots differ immensely, and that isn't an issue because they're obviously different books. I don't think the plot of Flowers in the Attic is terrible on its face. In fact, as a concept for a horror, I think it's actually great. This section is just going to be me pointing out the similarities, and in doing so, hopefully demonstrate why I think Flowers in the Attic failed so hard. I'll start the comparison with both protagonists of these books. For O Caledonia, we have Janet, the eldest of 5 children, a deeply misunderstood and disliked bookish young girl. She is ostracized from her family and her peers alike. She isn't feminine, she isn't particularly nice, and she has no friends except a jackdaw and a girl from school who is only friends with her out of necessity. She is devoted to literature and the classics and imagines the literary greats as her friends. For Flowers in the Attic, we have Kathy. She is beautiful with blonde hair and fair skin. She's a dancer, so she's very graceful and lithe. She's a bit of a brat, and she's smart in her own right, although she is always shown to be much dumber than Chris. She's compassionate and caring toward her siblings, and she loves them ferociously. Because she has spent most of her adolescence locked in an attic, she is also quite naive. I don't actually dislike either of these protagonists as they are written in these books, but what I have gleaned from the rest of the Dollanganger novels, Kathy just becomes a massive bitch who is so much of a slut that she has slept with basically every man that she ever meets. I think that even though on their face they are very different, both characters communicate a lot of the same struggles, particularly with growing up as a young girl into womanhood. Next, we'll cover the coming-of-age aspects of both novels. In my opinion, O Caledonia is a definite coming-of-age novel, while Flowers in the Attic is a horror and also a romance with coming-of-age elements. Now, neither girls actually comes of age in these books. Janet dies at 16 in her book, and Kathy is 15 when her book ends. So I'm just using that phrase in the metaphorical sense. For Janet, we see her grow from precocious child, adored by her grandfather, into graceless adolescent who is outshined by her beautiful younger sister. She doesn't have the feminine grace on her side like her mother or her sisters or her peers. She's awkward, and she's very smart in everything except arithmetic, which she is awful at. She does not get along well with boys. She has been harassed and nearly assaulted by them several times, and she isn't impressed by what she's seen by them. She only becomes infatuated with one boy, and it ultimately ends in her death. So, not a great puberty. Not to say that Kathy's is any better, seeing as she spent it locked in an attic. Obviously, we already know about Kathy's coming of age and her own boy troubles. But while Kathy is just, she's absolutely stunning, she's irresistible beauty, Janet is the opposite. I don't want to say that she's ugly, but it's said many times in O Caledonia that she's just no beauty. And I think the way that Andrews uses beauty and femininity in her novel adds another layer of grime to it. Kathy, at 15, is supposedly a grown woman, not just mentally because she has been forced to grow up beyond her years, but physically. Andrews makes it out that at 15, Kathy is ready to bear her own kids, basically. Contrast that with Janet, who really cannot be bothered to even think of boys, who is so awkward, and when she does fall in love, it's seen as overblown and disproportionate to actual events, because she's still a kid. And that's what teenagers do. If it wasn't clear in the last section, I have some issues with how Andrews wrote women and girls. The fact that she characterized Kathy as promiscuous just because she happened to have a body, and because she had a body that it was her fault she was raped. Yeah, I take issue with that. And when I contrast it to how Barker wrote Janet, who was faced with a similar situation, she was cornered in an abandoned room by a boy who tried to take advantage of her, but she stands her ground and actually ends up sending the boy to the hospital. And I don't want to get misconstrued, because it's obviously never someone's fault if they get raped, because they don't fight back. But Andrews writes just that. She has Kathy say to Chris, "No, you didn't rape me because I didn't fight back when I could have. I must have wanted it on some level." And this is after a disgusting scene where Kathy does fight back. So yeah, I have some issues with the way Andrews wrote her female characters. And that's on top of everything else, how she characterized Corinne as being this rude, neglectful bitch, and Olivia as being basically evil. And while male characters are seen as somewhat bad, specifically Malcolm, they pale in comparison to the evil women. I take issue with that. Janet's story is ultimately a tragedy. You know this from the onset, because the novel literally opens with her body being found. You read through all the chapters of her coming of age, all to know that it ends with a 16-year-old girl being murdered. It's a soul-crushing beginning and end, and that's what makes this book so good. Janet can't be saved. She must die, and you must watch it. Flowers in the Attic, on the other hand, is ultimately a comedy. While there is a veneer of gothic horror, and quite a good one, I do have to give Andrews this: she can write a compelling book. It boils down to Andrews desperately trying to have the reader root for these two siblings falling in love. If I was a more gracious person, and I didn't know that there are 6+ books in the series, and Kathy and Chris end up married with children, I might even give Andrews the benefit of the doubt and say that this element of trying to make incest romantic adds to the horror aspects of the novel. But no. There are 6 books in this series, and Kathy and Chris do end up married with children. So I will not be giving V.C. Andrews any grace. Theirs is a story of fated, star-crossed soulmates. Unlike O Caledonia, which you know is a tragedy and you must watch as young Janet dies, Flowers in the Attic is a comedy, and you must watch as young Chris and Kathy fall in love. So I guess ultimately, both girls are doomed. V.C. Andrews tried very hard to make Flowers in the Attic romantic, and it's not. Unfortunately, it is very well written. Andrews did have the skill to craft a very beautiful novel. But instead of framing this story as intensely fucked up and terrifying, she writes it as a love story. It's not just the relationship between Kathy and Chris. She also glorifies the marriage between Chris and Corinne, framing it as beautiful and good, while Corinne, away from her uncle husband, is a greedy, selfish biatch. And that glorification of incest as romance, is why this book is so troubling, why it is not good, and why it should ultimately be forgotten. Thank you all for watching. This one was not an easy one for me to put together because it's just kind of heavy. I know I love to hate books, but when the book is as fucked up as this one, and so uniquely beloved, it kind of hurts my soul. So if you made it this far, thank you. You truly deserve a prize. Go ahead and like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you like me, and comment if you'd like to chat. My Goodreads, Letterboxd, and Substack are all linked in the description. Go ahead and check those out. And that is all I have for you. Ta-ta! I poured myself a mug of wine.